From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The White House changes its line on inflation, admitting that it misjudged how serious it would be and laying out a new plan to get it under control. Will that make a difference to prices or to the political impact of inflation on the November elections? Plus, Britain celebrates the reign of 96-year-old Queen Elizabeth II with her Platinum Jubilee. Long live the Queen. Welcome, I'm Paul Gigot of the Wall Street Journal editorial page with Joe Sternberg, based in London, and Kim Strassel, who once worked in London. And before we get to the serious subject of inflation, let's talk about the Queen and the Platinum Jubilee. Joe, just learning that now you, the American citizen, have been in the UK for some time, becoming a dual national. Not that this in any way reduces your patriotic loyalty to these United States. But tell us a little bit about what you think. What's the meaning of this Platinum Jubilee, the first time a British monarch has ruled for 70 years?
It is a momentous occasion, first off, because there is the historical fact that you mentioned that they have never had a monarch who has reigned this long. And so I think that that by itself creates a certain excitement. But I think the deeper point here that an American audience in particular might not always understand is exactly how central the monarchy is to Britain's sense of itself as a nation, as a country, and the unifying role that the monarchy plays, and that this monarch in particular has taken on in terms of keeping what can be very disparate parts of the United Kingdom, whether you're talking about Scotland or England or Wales or Northern Ireland, keeping them together. The monarchy is a very important institution for doing that, and a lot of it has to do with the sort of relationship or the sense of common kinship that ordinary people feel that they have with Queen Elizabeth and her ability to connect with them and make them feel like she is sort of the monarch of one united kingdom. And so I think from that perspective, this is a very important national occasion for people in the UK to be reflecting on what it is that makes them part of a country together.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So the Queen became Queen, Elizabeth became Queen in 1952 upon the death of her father, King George VI. This is the first Platinum Jubilee for 70 years. Queen Victoria celebrated 60 years with a Diamond Jubilee in 1887. Of course, Queen Elizabeth's Diamond Jubilee was 2012. Kim, the point that Joe makes is an important one about the symbol of national unity, solidarity, helping to keep the United Kingdom united despite nationalist movements in Scotland and even Wales. People wonder if the Britain would break up without that kind of unifying head of state symbolism of the monarchy. And also key to her influence, symbolic and real to some extent, on patriotism and the national sentiment, is that she has managed to serve all this time by staying out, for the most part, of national political controversies. And she understands her role, sticks to it, and is that much more influential because of her restraint.
Yeah, I think that the remarkable aspect of this, and, Joe just said, I think Americans don't understand necessarily how central the monarchy is to Britain. I think what's even more remarkable is that it is so central because it didn't need to be that way. And the fact that it does remain central, I think, is almost entirely comes down to Elizabeth and the way that she has handled herself over the last 70 years. If you think about it, for quite some time now, the monarchy has been losing official powers. I mean, yes, she is officially the commander-in-chief of Britain's armed forces. She has the ability to dissolve parliament and calls elections. She opens parliament. Believe it or not, some people don't know this, no law can actually go into effect unless the Queen delivers assent. Although the last time a monarch didn't deliver assent was in the 1700s. I think the important point here is she has created this kind of mystique around herself, an ethic of hard work, of patriotism, etc. And then, as you said, been very, very careful not to engage in any kind of political action that would cause the British people to sort of reject the monarchy, because the monarchy in essence exists really through the agreement and good graces of the public and the public will. And so now That being said, I don't think that there's any question. She actually does influence a lot of power behind the scenes, but that is a closely guarded secret. She has regular interactions with her prime ministers. There's a lot of stories about things that she has sort of engaged in, but publicly, she's very careful not to step into it very often.
Not to default here to a television series, but if you watched The Crown on Netflix, which I thoroughly enjoyed, the most fascinating scenes in many ways were the ones where those interactions you mentioned with the prime ministers over time, starting with Churchill, going through Wilson, and of course Margaret Thatcher, who was not played very well in that series, but nonetheless was long serving and very, very successful prime minister. It is really fascinating. And at age 96, she, of course, will eventually cede the throne to her successors. Prince Charles is the next in line of succession. After him would be Prince William. And I guess the question, Joe, is without Elizabeth in this turbulent period, will the next generation be able to hold it together?
It is a question. It's a very serious question. And in fact, it's kind of interesting if you listen to a lot of the discussion here. I mean, even though everyone knows that the Queen is quite elderly at this point, and when you see her in public, she does seem frailer, which is entirely natural for someone of her age. There is still a real reluctance to talk very much about the succession. And I think that can be interpreted in part as a sign that people are a bit nervous about that. I think that part of it is that Prince Charles just doesn't seem to inspire the same degree of personal affection that Elizabeth has, both when she was a princess and then after she ascended to the throne. And so I think that there's this concern that there won't be that personal connection to a King Charles when the time comes. And there's also the problem that he seems to be interested or perhaps willing to be more openly engaged in various political issues than she's ever been, particularly on some environmental issues. And I wouldn't necessarily say that the way that he wades into some of that is particularly controversial. It has a lot to do with very well-publicized organic farming and, concern for the countryside. So it's not necessarily that people would rebel against that because they wouldn't agree with him, but I think that there would just be this sense that part of what has maintained this, almost you use the word magic for lack of a better term, about Elizabeth has been that strange combination she has achieved of both aloofness, but then also personal connection with people. And I think that's going to be very difficult for any of her successors to master.
Kim, a few years back, I saw a show on Broadway, which I think also ran on the West End, about a British monarch who was, I think, fashioned after Prince Charles, who attempts to actually use the power of the throne for political causes and influence.
Idea.
And it didn't end well in the in the show, as I suspect it would not in real life as well. The question about whether or not the next generation has the right stuff, very real. Charles obviously has had a much more, how shall we say, colorful past across his very public career as a member of the royal family. Personally, I wish it well. I hope the institution survives. It has not obviously prevented Britain from being a democratic country, but there are uses for having a head of state who represents nationhood.
Yeah, and by the way, I think the consequences, if that went badly, extend beyond Britain. Joe was talking about the importance of her in terms of Scotland and Wales, et cetera, and domestic questions. But there are huge international questions here as well, too. Never forget that when she took over, she was actually the head of an empire that spanned a globe. That empire was dismantled during her tenure, replaced by a commonwealth, which I think now is about 15 countries. But she has exercised enormous soft power in keeping those Commonwealth countries united in certain bigger purposes. There's an interesting precept that British politicians use, this doctrine called "thou shalt not embarrass the Queen." They use that as leverage a lot in their negotiations with those other countries. Don't take actions that would make the crown have to step in and do anything that would sow disunity. If you end up with a Charles in charge, can that really stand given that Charles does such a good job of embarrassing himself all the time? And so I think that there is a kind of worry that if you end up with a monarchy that doesn't engender that kind of respect and that doesn't therefore exercise that amount of soft power, that there's a real chance that the Commonwealth itself, all these different disparate nations around the world that have been remained united in democratic issues and doing the right thing, sometimes in issues of war, you won't necessarily have that power. And I think that could be very harmful in ways that go way beyond just Britain.
Another reason to say, long live the Queen. We are going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the changing politics and the changing line on inflation from the Biden administration when we come back.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot with Kim Strassel and Joe Sternberg. And let's turn to American politics and administration's rollout this week of a new anti-inflation theme and plan, such as it is. The president, starting with an op-ed in our newspaper, the Wall Street Journal, talking about his three-point plan, followed up with a very public meeting with Jerome Powell, the head of the Federal Reserve, on Tuesday, and also an appearance by Janet Yellen, Secretary of the Treasury, where she does something of a mea culpa on inflation. Let's listen.
I think I was wrong then about the path that inflation would take. As I mentioned, there have been unanticipated and large shocks to the economy that have boosted energy and food prices and supply bottlenecks that have affected our economy badly that I at the time didn't fully understand, but we recognize that now.
Joe, the way I think about this statement by the Treasury Secretary is it's more culpa than mea. I mean, there's some blame, but it's blame for underestimating events that were essentially outside their control, such as supply chain woes caused by the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, and so on. What she doesn't do is take any responsibility for the administration's policies leading to the price increases we see. But nonetheless, it's still interesting that they felt that as a political matter, it was important for them to recognize that, okay, we've got a bad problem on our hands. It's no longer just transitory. It's a big problem, and here's our plan to address it.
Yep, I think that's exactly what's going on here. I mean, we're a few months out from the midterm election. It is an unavoidable issue as much as Democrats have tried to run away from it. And so I think they're now reached the point where they have done everything about inflation that they can think of except, try to tackle it head on in some fashion. So we're kind of reaching the political Hail Mary stage of this. But what jumps out at me about the Yellen comments in particular is, two issues that are so strange about that formulation. The first is that she's really admitting that Secretary Yellen and the Fed and a lot of mainstream macroeconomists who've been feeding the Biden administration bad economic advice don't really understand the supply side of the economy. So, that's the first half of the culpa part there, that they just kind of did not understand how all of these supply chain issues would weigh on the economy. They haven't understood why supplier productivity has been so sluggish in terms of catching up to all of this demand that they created, through the various stimulus payments, plus the very easy monetary policy that we've had. So I think that they are kind of belatedly realizing that that was a big weakness in their outlook. The other odd part of this, though, is that she's not talking about the thing that they thought that they were affecting. Nowhere in that formulation do you have any discussion about those stimulus bills or about the monetary policy that did so much to stoke demand in the economy at the same time that they were really sitting on the supply side.
Now, I know from my own reporting that in private, Secretary Yellen does concede that, and I have this from good reporting, that the March 2021 spending bill, that $1.9 trillion extravaganza, did contribute, in fact, to excess demand, as Larry Summers and some of the others have been. Others have been saying right from the start, but they don't want to admit that publicly because, of course, they want that spending bill to be used as something they say has created the strong economy and recovery that they claim was not underway when Donald Trump was president, when, of course, it actually was very strong growth towards the end of 2020. Kim, the op-ed piece in our paper laid out a three-point plan. One, first, let the Federal Reserve do its job. He won't interfere with the Fed, even though he brought Jay Powell in for the White House to talk to him. But, well, that was just, I guess a laying on of hands saying, Jay, you have my blessing to do whatever you want, but I won't get in the way. Second, we're going to have all these policies to try to reduce prices here and there, release the strategic petroleum reserve oil to keep oil prices down. We're going to fix supply chains. We're going to pass Build Back Better, which will increase infrastructure, which will somehow keep prices down. And then the third point, we're going to reduce the budget deficit. Though how he manages to do that while wanting to pass Build Back Better, which is even more spending, I guess it's with tax increases. But tax increases reduce the supply of the side of the economy, as Joe has mentioned. And that would actually increase the supply-demand mismatch.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, other than the Federal Reserve piece of this, everything he lays out is almost the exact opposite of what they need to be doing. He's talking about more spending out of Congress. That's simply going to, again, increase demand, most likely. That will have to be paid for by higher taxes, which is going to reduce supply. I would make the argument that simply the constant broadcasting by the administration of their intentions to raise taxes of all sizes and forms has already resulted in a knock-on supply as businesses pull back in concern out of the expectation that they're going to get hit with those higher taxes. And, as to the federal deficit, most of this is simply those reductions are a result of the fact that we're no longer spending more than $6 trillion as we did each year during the pandemic. So you're seeing it's simply a math question of that reduction. I also was amused that he actually said that the tax increases that were coming in, the revenue that was coming from his economic policies, is coming from inflation as people are getting put into higher and higher tax brackets, et cetera. One organization that makes out really, really good in inflation is the federal government. But I think this goes to Joe's point that if they're not going to internalize or publicly acknowledge what really went wrong here, then they're just going to be encouraged to keep making the same mistake over and over again, or at least feel licensed to. And that is not going to help them with their inflation problem.
Yeah, Joe, when I look at the president's plan, I look and say, okay, well, if you did prevail on the Saudis to increase oil production, maybe you could make a difference in global supply and demand on oil, keep that down, that price down, at least not have it keep rise up to $130 or $40 a barrel, as some people fear given the reductions in Russian supply on the global market. He could, if he wanted to, send a very good signal, but he won't do this, to American producers of oil and gas. That would help send a message that might have an immediate effect, actually, if people said, okay, we're going to be liberated to go produce and the administration won't punish us. Of course, he won't do that for reasons having to do with the climate politics in his own party. But other than that, there isn't a lot. I mean, they could reduce tariffs as well against China, but they don't seem to want to do that. But other than that, there's not a heck of a lot that they can do. This is really going to be up to the Federal Reserve substantially, in my opinion.
Yes, and that's why it's also worth thinking a bit more about the Fed component of the Biden inflation plan, because I mean it's absolutely correct that the Fed plays an outsized role here, and in fact I think that a lot of misguided Fed policy over the past couple of years has created this inflation, as the Fed is sort of belatedly getting itself organized to admit now. Sort of. So, I mean, obviously, you're going to have to see some kind of monetary normalization here. And I still think that they're probably in denial about what that's going to mean, because historically, you need a positive inflation-adjusted interest rate. The interest rate needs to be higher than the inflation rate. I mean, for all of the talk that the Fed is doing about these half-point increases over coming meetings, they're pretty far off having rate rises that would be sufficient to get to that point. And, then you can't also separate that out from the political background. I mean, one of the things people picked up on with this meeting between Powell and Biden this week was this sense that they're trying to recreate some of the magic between Reagan and Paul Volcker in the early 80s, where the sense was that Reagan had kind of given his political blessing to the Fed to make difficult decisions to get inflation under control. What that misses is that Reagan understood that the elected branches needed to play a role here too, in terms of unlocking the supply side of the economy, tax reform, deregulation. If you don't have that, you can get the monetary normalization from the Fed, but you end up producing a lot of misery without really a viable economic growth path out of it. And I think that kind of economic growth path out of the inflation is the big thing that is missing from the Biden inflation plan.
For those who don't remember that era of high inflation in the 1980s, there was the Reagan agenda had adopted the economist Robert Mundell's plan, which was essentially a lever using monetary policy to reduce prices, control inflation, and then using fiscal policy and regulatory policy to increase the supply side of the economy through tax cuts and offset some of the dampening effects on the economy of rising interest rates. Kim, just to last point, you get the last word here, and just talk about the politics of all of this leading into November, because my suspicion is that the longer this inflation persists, and it's been persistent now, really accelerating since October of last year, and expectations have set in, people can see it, and it may be the case that no matter what this administration does, and even if inflation does peak here either now or in the next month or two, the damage politically from inflation, the administration may not be able to overcome it for Democrats in November.
Especially because even if it does peak, as you say, it's not going to go away overnight. It's still going to be hitting everyone's pocketbook as they go to pull the lever in November, most likely. And, as we've talked about before, there are a few things that are more deadly to politicians than presiding over inflation. It is something that really turns the public in a sour mood, and the obvious target is the person in the White House. And so I think this is why you see Democrats increasingly desperate to change the subject in one way, shape, or form. Right now, they're talking very much about new gun control measures, given the shootings. This is actually even a bit surprising to me because I think gun control is also a bit of a dodgy political issue. It's not a home run. And they're talking, too, about a renewed slim down, build back better, green climate bill. Again, I'm not quite sure about the politics of this, but I think it's all says something about just how much they want to change the subject. I don't think it's going to work because this is not something that you can make people forget. Biden now has his op-ed, and we'll see how much more they address it, but this is a big and growing headache for them.
Very much agree, Kim. Thanks to you. Thanks to Joe. Thanks to all of you for listening. Remember, you can catch us every day on the Potomac Watch podcast. You can also send us your cards, letters, praise, criticism, what have you, to pwpodcast@wsj.com. And we hope to have you with us tomorrow for another edition of Potomac Watch.